Welcome back to the DeTal Center podcast. Like always, I'm Gwen and I'm here with Christy. And before we get into today's topic, just a reminder that the views and opinions expressed in this podcast are not the official positions of the Department of Justice or the COPS office. And with that, Christy, you want to take us away and get us introduced?
Yeah, so as we've mentioned before in previous podcasts, wellness-centered de-escalation, which the DeTal Center trains on, is evidence-based and assessed for applications in the field. Today we're here with Matt Jones, who is also interested in ensuring that law enforcement professionals have evidence-based training in relation to investigative interviewing. Thank you for joining us, Matt.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the questions, is there anything you would like to say to preface?
No, go ahead.
All right. So then do you mind introducing yourself and giving us a brief introduction into EVOCAVI?
Sure. So my name is Matt Jones. I am the president of EVOCAVI and one of its lead instructors. EVOCAVI is a interview training and consultancy company that provides science-based interviewing to federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, threat mitigation units, corporate security, and Department of Commerce investigators. We provide this training in the U.S. and abroad. EVOCAVI is also actively involved in research collaborations in developing interview training curricula and field validation testing to guide the innovation of new tactics that are both ethical and relevant to investigative interviewing tradecraft. Prior to starting EVOCAVI, I retired as a homicide detective after completing 21 years in law enforcement. In 2015, I began collaborating with researchers due to an interest in being involved in the research that was supporting science-based interview tactics and training. And in 2020, EVOCAVI was founded and we began to officially provide training.
Awesome. So what inspired you to start EVOCAVI and how did your law enforcement experience help shape that original mission?
Yeah, well, in 2013, I began looking into the different types of interview trainings that were being taught throughout the US to law enforcement agencies. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to identify any information that was supporting that what we were being taught was helping us to elicit more reliable information from interviewees, was encouraging more information disclosure, or was mitigating uncooperative behavior. In fact, what I was learning is that much of what we were being taught was working against us in these areas. And this curiosity led me to explore the research behind science-based interviewing and specifically led to an interest in improving law enforcement interview tactics and also interview training.
How did all of that kind of come together and lead to you picking the sort of name of EVOCAVI? Is there meaning behind that?
It's a great question. Yeah, so the name for the company, EVOCAVI, comes from the Latin word evoco, meaning to summon, to call out, and is also related to the noun, evocation. And that means to draw out someone's perspective, their feelings, their beliefs. This concept of evocation is the foundation of what we teach in all of our courses, such as our 5-day corroboration-based interviewing course, our 2-day proximity-based disclosure course for investigators. And evocation is also important because being curious about an interviewee's perspective enhances the social dynamics in the interview in terms of communication and connecting with someone. It helps to lower the perception of a power differential in the room and encourages interviewees to share more details.
That's all really interesting. And I know we're going to get a little bit more into that later in our interview, but kind of just starting with the basics. So how would your own investigative experience combined with those collaborative experience with researchers? And then when we talked before we did this Zoom today, you told us about your experience with consulting in wrongful conviction cases. And how has that all kind of come together to produce your training methods, and how are those training methods different than standard what you would see today, like normally in police interview training?
Yeah, so specifically my investigative experience taught me the value on the front end of an investigation of how important it is to corroborate evidence and information during an investigation and how an effective evidence disclosure strategy during an interview can elicit more reliable information from victims, witnesses, and suspects. While my experience collaborating with researchers was a little bit different, that has helped me to see what a complex and unique interaction a law enforcement interview is, and how different this interaction is from other interactions that law enforcement may have out in the community or even in social interactions. And let me give you a few examples. A law enforcement interview is very private. It's not held in the public's purview. It's, in a room. Sometimes they may actually be recording it either visually with a video or audio, but for the most part, it's a very private encounter. There is also this umbrella of consequences that's overhanging a law enforcement interview, which is different than a lot of other interactions. Interviewees that are in the room, whether they're a victim, a witness, or even a suspect, they don't want to be there. Okay, this isn't something where they look forward to coming into a law enforcement interview. There's also the perception of a power differential between the law enforcement investigator and the interviewee. And there's a sense of a loss of autonomy for people because they are being either asked or they're being told or taken into custody to be inside that room. So they may feel like their autonomy, their freedom of choice is being restricted. And there's also challenges for investigators in trying to establish their credibility in these investigations, thanks to everything that's put out there on the movies and on TV about all the dirty things that supposedly detectives do all the time. So we're not exactly helping ourselves in that area. But, all these areas really came to me from being involved with the research community. And combined with experiences in consulting on wrongful conviction cases for 5 years, these experiences have really shaped me. I see a tremendous value in the science-based interview approach over a traditional approach that is not supported by research, and that the science-based interview approach is more ethical, more considerate of the operational challenges that investigators are facing. It also allows them to elicit more reliable information and allows the investigators to be more strategic towards obtaining their informational objectives.
So with all of your experience and what you just discussed, what was the process like of designing a science-based training program or interviews?
Yeah, so the whole process really started back in 2019 through a wonderful collaboration with two researchers to develop this 5-day science-based interview course. And we started from scratch. And that was a tremendous amount of work. And it really was just one of the most impactful things I think I've ever done. Now, along with that, though, that initial program really focused on the core competencies of what we think are important to law enforcement interviews, while also adding on investigative tactics to build upon those core competencies. But that curriculum has developed and it's changed over the last 5 years. And we continue to innovate with new tactics and new ideas in terms of how to teach the tactics. So there's more of a focus now on teaching tradecraft combined with translating the research related to that tradecraft. But the actual process was quite interesting. We started out the process of obviously doing a literature review of what can we glean from the research on science-based interviewing that we might find helpful for U.S. investigators, but also in terms of the training. Is there any training out there that we thought was relevant that could provide guidance here too as we develop this new program? So that initial phase was just about getting a lay of the land in terms of the research and the training. The second phase, though, was more about developing the curriculum and making sure that the curriculum was relevant to our audience. From that, then, it required a lot of data collection and field validation testing. And I say this because this is what's really differentiating this type of curriculum from the majority of curriculums that you're going to see out there in the US that are being advocated and taught by these LinkedIn influencers who are developing an interview curriculum that they're saying is science-based. Well, those curriculums have never actually been research-based. They have not been tested. They have not been validated. So they're not really science-based curriculums, even though they say they are. So that's why we wanted to go through this field validation testing, not only with this 5-day course, but with the other course that we teach, the proximity-based evidence disclosure. And we are going to be doing this with every other course that we roll out to make sure it goes through the same process. So once we got done collecting all that data and doing the field validation, then it came time for the actual post-testing evaluation. And this is where the researchers collaborating were just invaluable here, because they allowed us to accurately evaluate whether the techniques that we taught were being used, and also looking at the data. How do we translate the data to see were the techniques actually effective or not? And this is where you really have to swallow your ego, because not everything is going to work the way you want it to. But this is where we start to pick apart the data to identify, well, why didn't this technique show direct effects? What do we need to improve? Was it me as the trainer that was teaching it? Was it the material that was being taught? Was it the audience? So there are a lot of variables that could go into this that we have to start looking at. But that's the whole idea of going through this process and developing a curriculum that's science-based, is we get to really start to narrow down on what's effective and what's not for investigators.
Yeah, I know that I've had a little bit experience with that peer review process, and oh, it can be brutal. Like, you got
Yes,
to
it's
check
very
your ego.
intimidating.
It's so helpful and you get so much great feedback, but sometimes you're like, ouch, that hurt a little bit. I've worked hard on this. Don't tell me
Yes, it
these things.
does. It absolutely does. And I will say, you really have to be open to criticism, but that criticism that we received and each of the field validation tests that we've done was very helpful. At the same time, this is a way of preventing junk science from being
Yep.
pushed out of science-based. So this is a nice way to catch that, hopefully, ahead of time.
Yeah, so thank you for telling us about your process. So now that you've kind of got your training in and it's done and you're given it, so what are some of the misconceptions that people in law enforcement still hold about what science-based interviewing actually means?
Yeah, and there are quite a few misconceptions out there, and I'll just go through several of them here. The first one being that all interview training is science-based, and that's not the case. There are a lot of interview companies out there now that are trying to adopt the term being science-based because they realize what a buzzword this is. A lot of the other trainings that law enforcement has been involved in over the last 15 to 20 years have been considered very much evidence-based. But interviewing was not one of them until the last 10 years. And now that we're starting to see more interest from agencies in adopting a science-based interview curriculum, this is where we see a lot of these companies claiming to be science-based when they really are not. So not all programs are science-based. Number two, that the science-based interview tactics, sometimes we hear people say, well, these are soft tactics. And I'm not sure exactly what that means, but what I think it means is that because these tactics do not advocate for the use of deception, coercion, confrontation, accusations, that they are perceived as soft tactics, I would say that's completely a mistake in terms of interpreting that way. These science-based interview tactics teach investigators how to be more strategic, how to get to their informational objectives more effectively, how to deal with an uncooperative subject and mitigate uncooperative behavior, how to create an environment that someone will feel comfortable to share details with us. But most importantly, they contribute to eliciting more memory compatible, reliable information. So I certainly wouldn't call these soft tactics. There's the misconception that science-based interview trainings are the same in terms of one science-based interview training compared to another. And they're not all the same. Even though we share the same ambition that the science-based interview training programs should elicit more reliable information and should conduct more ethical interviews, we do share those same ideals. Not all the tactics that we are teaching in each of these programs are going to be operationally relevant. And what I mean by operationally relevant is that when we look at what law enforcement actually does, sometimes there are science-based interview tactics that are not always relevant to what we do. Sometimes the science-based interviewing tactics are maybe too theoretical for what the practical reality is of what law enforcement is doing. And some are just not appropriate for the context of a law enforcement interview. So we have certain science-based tactics that are out there, but they weren't developed for law enforcement interviews. They were developed for something else, but law enforcement has adopted them, and we need more research to study whether or not those are actually ethical. And there's also a misconception that all agencies, federal, state, and local, should use the same science-based interviewing curriculum. I think this is a big mistake because what might work well for one specific federal agency is not going to be applicable for local law enforcement and vice versa. So, there are a lot of these misconceptions out there. We're trying to address these. One of the things that we've done recently to address this is we've created an educational video. And this was developed by one of our science advisors, Dr. Simon Oleskiewicz, and it's posted on our website. And I will make sure that you have the link to send out to your viewers here. And this educational video is specifically about talking through how do we define how a curriculum is science-based or not for law enforcement interviews.
So you just mentioned the website.
Mm-hmm.
And on the site, you emphasize shifting from reactive interviewing to a proactive, cooperation-centered mindset. Can you unpack what that kind of means for our listeners, and what would that look like in practice for an investigator?
Sure, and I know that may seem like a lot, so let me try to break this down the best I can. The majority of interview training programs teach tactics that are, for the most part, very reactive. Meaning, for example, that when an interviewee says A, they are instructing the investigator to do B. And this type of training does not truly teach investigators how to adopt interview skills that make them very flexible and adaptable. And it often leaves investigators very frustrated and more likely to revert to non-productive tactics that discourage an interviewee from cooperating and disclosing information. So we like to emphasize moving away from being reactive as much as possible and develop an investigative mindset of being proactive, because it allows our trainees to better anticipate the interview challenges that can come up and engage during these challenges with more informed response tactics. This is what teaching an interview tradecraft is all about. So specifically, when we talk about proactive strategies, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of them here to give you an idea, that we teach in this course, or actually all the courses. Being proactive, for example, about eliciting an interviewee's perspective of law enforcement and what is motivating that perspective. So drawing out from an interviewee, what do they think about law enforcement? How do they feel about being involved in an interview? And trying to understand what is motivating their perspective. That is one way of doing this, as opposed to coming into the interview and just guessing as to how they feel about it. So we're asking investigators to be proactive and go after that. Being proactive about assessing cooperative behavior throughout the entire interview. Okay? There are things that we can look at in terms of a person's cooperation level that should give us an indication at different points in the interview of what might be motivating whether or not someone is being cooperative, uncooperative, or something else. And we need to find out what is motivating that behavior if we're going to ever attempt to understand whether or not they're providing reliable information. We can also be proactive about establishing the investigator's credibility. And this is something that we emphasize a lot with our investigators, is we want them to do things in the interview that support their credibility, to show that they are credible, that they are not lying and making things up, that they are being transparent. So these are just a few of the ways that we start to teach proactive strategies during an interview. But we also teach these corroboration strategies that are equally important. A lot of the interviews that we get to see during these research projects, and when we get feedback from prosecutors about their own investigators and their own interviews, we are hearing and seeing that investigators are not taking the time and putting a lot of effort in to corroborate the reliability of the information they're eliciting. While they may focus just on a suspect, they often ignore victims and witnesses. And we know that victims and witnesses at times do not always tell the truth. So we encourage investigators to corroborate as much as possible. And I'll give you a few examples here. We will encourage them to corroborate as much of an interviewee's account of their involvement in an incident as possible. Corroborate the reliability of an item of evidence. Okay, that's at the very basic foundational level. You have an item of evidence. Let's try to corroborate whether or not it's even reliable. And then what we want to do is start to corroborate connections from that item of evidence to another item of evidence to another item of evidence. And in doing so, if we can show that there is corroboration between those items of evidence, it will likely enhance the reliability of all of those items of evidence. And then we want to take those items of evidence and we also want to attempt to corroborate any connections, any nexus to a suspect so that we can show that there is a reliable connection there and that our investigative conclusions that this person was involved in this actually have support. And then finally, the last area I want to mention here with corroboration, it's important for us to also corroborate intent. So when we talk about intent, we're talking about the culpable mental state that we have to deal with in criminal interviews. And those culpable mental states in most jurisdictions are, did someone intentionally do this? Did they knowingly do this? Did they recklessly do this? Or did they negligently do this? Those culpable mental states are very important for us to try to corroborate because they will often dictate the type of crime that we may be charging and also the level of the crime we may be charging. So these corroboration strategies are absolutely critical when we put a case forward to the prosecutors so that they can see that the evidence has been corroborated and is reliable.
So I'm kind of going to touch on that same question. I think you answered it, but just to reiterate. So why exactly would be relying on those detecting deception and gut instincts, those reactive measures, be so problematic during an interview?
Yeah, and this is exactly why we're spending so much time teaching corroboration strategies to investigators. According to the research, and I'll just touch on a few things briefly, the majority of deception detection training offered to law enforcement focuses on these nonverbal cues that have since been debunked by the research as non-diagnostic of deception, meaning that they are highly inaccurate. So things that I know I was taught when I started at the police department, such as if a person looks up one way and they look up another way, one of these two is going to be indicative of them being deceptive. If a person is sitting in their chair and they're fidgeting, it's going to be indicative of them being deceptive. These are things that the research have debunked as being accurate. And we know that when they started looking at these perceptions of deception between lay people and also very experienced law enforcement investigators, they were very poor at identifying people who were being deceptive using these cues. So we know they're not accurate. In terms of gut instinct, the use of gut instinct can also be very problematic due to an overconfidence bias by the investigator, in which the investigator is only looking for information that confirms their belief about what occurred and who was involved, and can lead to them ignoring evidence that would actually lead them to the real suspect. The last point I'll make here is that in my 21 years in working in law enforcement, I've never had a prosecutor ever ask me for my subjective opinion about whether a suspect was lying. It was always about whether I was able to corroborate the evidence and information and how reliable my conclusions were. So this is why we're really encouraging investigators focus on corroborating the evidence and information and stay away from making subjective opinions about deception and whether or not someone's lying.
So you mentioned a lot about how evidence is the key here to avoid any bias. You're not trying to make sure evidence fits into what you think. You're corroborating everything together. On the site, it also mentions proximity-based evidence disclosure. Would you mind explaining what that means and how that improves both information quality and interview reliability?
Sure. So back in 2018, I just want to give some background to this. I began having discussions with another researcher, Dr. Simon Olskiewicz, about the lack of relevant training related to disclosing evidence in an interview. And we continued having debates about the state of the current research on evidence disclosure and how law enforcement investigators should evaluate and use evidence in their interviews. And then in 2020, we obtained a research grant from the FBI to develop and test a new evidence disclosure training protocol that we named Proximity-Based Evidence Disclosure, also known as PED. The goal of proximity-based evidence disclosure training is to provide better evidence disclosure tactics to investigators that are more relevant to what they do and encourage more reliable details from interviewees and assist prosecutors in charging cases in which more of the evidence has actually been corroborated. Now, specifically, we wanted to develop an evidence disclosure training that enhances the reliability of the information being elicited. And we did this in several ways. Number one, we focused on corroboration. We trained investigators to disclose evidence in their interviews with a focus on corroboration, as opposed to disclosing evidence to make subjective assessments of deception by the interviewee. We also focused on reliability, and this was important because we didn't see a lot of efforts in the evidence disclosure research to emphasize training investigators on understanding the reliability and evaluating the reliability of the evidence they had. So we trained investigators on how to better evaluate the reliability of evidence and information. And this was important because unlike what we see in the research literature and the way that researchers talk about evidence disclosure, we don't walk into an interview, in a law enforcement interview, and disclose one item of evidence after another, after another, after another to a suspect without having other challenges come up while we disclose the evidence. We also don't have evidence all the time that's completely perfect, that's completely strong and probative for us. So these are the realities of what we're dealing with. So we wanted to teach investigators how to assess and evaluate the reliability of evidence so that they could better utilize which evidence they thought was most probative here, but also understand how to introduce evidence that maybe wasn't very strong, but without misrepresenting the evidence. And that brings me into my next point, talking about evidence utility. By training investigators how to appropriately utilize all the evidence, not just evidence that appeared to be the strongest, to encourage information disclosure, we helped investigators identify more opportunities to elicit information to corroborate and encourage more disclosure from interviewees. So we had them look at all the evidence and understand better how to introduce it and not misrepresent the evidence to encourage more information disclosure. Now, one of the other aids that we developed in this proximity-based evidence disclosure training was what we refer to as the evidence framing table. And the evidence framing table simply is a preparatory aid that we created for investigators to show them how to start framing and explaining their evidence during an interview. And it's simply a table that we created for them to show them how they could frame statements to introduce each item of evidence. But it did a lot more than that. And this is what we are really focusing on, how this helps investigators also elicit more reliable information. Because in putting it all on the table, this helped investigators to look at evidence transitions. And what I mean by that is how to transition from one item of evidence to another to another. Because we're not just trying to disclose evidence here, we're trying to elicit new details, but we're also trying to facilitate accurate memory recall of those details as we're disclosing evidence. So the evidence transitions are a big part of what we teach with the evidence framing table. But another part of that is how to prioritize the order in which you disclose evidence. In my law enforcement career, I never had any training that taught me the value and the importance of how do we develop an evidence disclosure order and what kind of considerations should go into that. So with this table, we suggest to investigators that they are going to start with the item of evidence that's farthest away from the scene in proximity, and then gradually work their way in incrementally. That will be their evidence disclosure order in the majority of cases. This allows them to better corroborate connections between items of evidence, and it also facilitates better, more accurate memory recall with the evidence and information. Now, of course, there are some caveats to this. There are some cases that proximity of an item of evidence may be irrelevant. And we talk about those type of cases, those exceptions with investigators. But for the most part, all of their cases are going to really depend on proximity. And that's what we have them focus on, that disclosure order. Now, we also have another consideration with them, and that is, when do they withhold an item of evidence? When do they take an item of evidence and not disclose it at all? And this is important too for eliciting reliable information and, more importantly, evaluating that information. Because wouldn't it be great if we had an item of evidence or several items of evidence that we did not disclose during an interview, that were not disclosed to the public at all, that we could then later use to corroborate the reliability of other items of evidence and information. So that's also another way that the evidence framing table can be helpful here. And it also is helpful because it encourages collaboration. So because it encourages collaboration between the investigator and the interviewee, this allows the investigator to demonstrate their credibility. And this is something that we emphasize a lot. In order to be effective with disclosing evidence in an interview, you've got to be able to demonstrate that you are credible, that you are authentic, that you are being transparent. Because if an interviewee suspects that you're not, suspects that you're lying to them, why should they participate and address the evidence at all if they think you're making all this up? So credibility is a big part of this. And the last point is that this allows us to also identify persons of interest that maybe were not involved in this, because we are emphasizing corroborating the reliability of the information. We are also identifying people that had nothing to do with this incident, which means we can exclude them as persons of interest and focus on people that are obviously have more liability involved. Now, the two other points I'll make to this, in terms of the demeanor of the investigator with using this technique, we stress that the investigators have a demeanor of being curious, inquisitive, and seeking clarification at all times, and especially during when you're disclosing evidence. So this demeanor is incredibly important, being curious, inquisitive, even when you have extremely strong evidence. And that's why we see investigators become so successful with this, because their demeanor doesn't change from the beginning of the interview to later on, where we're starting to talk about really sensitive topics, where we're getting into sensitive areas with evidence. That demeanor is staying consistent. And finally, we are suggesting to investigators not to use risky evidence disclosure tactics, such as lying to people, such as misrepresenting the evidence, and also using hypothetical statements. So this is how, the proximity-based evidence disclosure technique is really starting to promote, eliciting more reliable details from interviewees. And it's not just with suspects. This technique can be taught to be used with victims and witnesses as well, because victims and witnesses also at times may forget things. They may not be telling the truth about everything. And it's our job not to jump to conclusions and assume they're being deceptive, and try to find out what is motivating that type of response.
Awesome. So once again, I think you kind of answered this, but I'm going to get a little bit more nitty-gritty into it. So how do these practices help reduce those false confessions and still allow critical information to be obtained by the interviewer?
Yeah, so I guess the first thing I would mention that I brought up a couple times already is when we focus on memory with the science-based interview strategies, there's a focus on avoiding tactics, any tactics that may diminish the reliability of the information being obtained from a victim, a witness, or a suspect. So one of the core parts of any curriculum that is actually science-based should be using tactics that are memory compatible. What do we want to avoid? Well, we want to avoid things that are non-productive for memory, asking leading questions, using coercion, using theming, such as maximization and minimization tactics, using confrontation. These are all things that we know that can hurt memory recall and contaminate an interview. In terms of things that support memory recall, that are memory compatible, well, using topic funnels to get to your information. The cognitive interview, one of the most widely interviewed or studied interview protocols that we have, completely supports memory recall. So that would be the first thing that differentiates between science-based and the more traditional information, but it also reduces the likelihood of false confessions. Another area that the science-based interview tactics have done a nice job of honing in on are these dispositional and situational risk factors. Now, science-based interview tactics are considered of dispositional risk factors, and those are very simply any type of risk factors that are specific to a person. And we do have what are called vulnerable populations. And when I refer to vulnerable population, we're talking about people that are under the age of 18, have mental health issues, that may have intellectual disabilities. We know that these populations can be highly suggestible, highly susceptible to providing a false confession. There are also other populations, such as people that have been traumatized. Science-based interview tactics should be taken into consideration in the techniques that they've developed and are using. Two examples that I refer to the most are child forensic interviewing protocols, the cognitive interview. These again address these dispositional risk factors to lower the chance of getting a false confession. The situational risk factors, though, are going to be different. These look at the actual situation, the environment around the interview. So the duration of the interview, whether or not the person's needs were being addressed, whether or not they had food and water, whether or not they were allowed to use the bathroom, the number of interviewers in the room, or the interrogation tactics that are being used. These are all areas that the research has done a really nice job of highlighting why it's so important to address these with science-based interview protocols, because they reduce the likelihood of false confessions. And the duration of the interview is a great example here. A lot of these false confessions happen in long interviews that are taking place that last longer than 4 hours, that may go all the way up to 30 hours. So the duration is a big factor here. So it's another way the science view interview tactics have been helpful, but they also promote tactics that are coercion-free. So any type of science-based interview protocol should not involve coercion. Science-based interviewing emphasizes cooperation versus gaining compliance. If we can encourage people to cooperate, obviously we're more likely to get more reliable information. We're less likely to get a false confession. When we push people towards compliance, then we see more likelihood of obtaining a false confession. The science-based interview tactics also emphasize the investigator's credibility. They should be using tactics that support the investigator's credibility and their transparency. And they're also going to emphasize freedom of choice, the person's autonomy, and showing acceptance to what they have to say. And this just simply means that when someone, a victim, witness, or a suspect may provide you with their opinion about something or respond to a question, we need to show acceptance for that. Okay? Even if their perspective may conflict with the evidence we may have or other factors that we're aware of, we need to show acceptance. So these are all ways that help us to avoid false confessions that are supported by a science-based interview curriculum.
So the DeTal Center's de-escalation training allows participants to practice what they're learning through simulation cutscenes and live role-play simulations, which Gwen could go in more detail about in a second too. Does EVOCAVI training have similar methods that allow participants to practice what they have learned?
Absolutely. And as we're going to talk about here in a second, I think there's a lot of commonality between the type of training that you're providing, the methods that you're providing the training. And in terms of practical exercises, we do a lot of role playing in our courses. We essentially have a practical exercise for almost every single module that we are teaching. So besides doing role playing, we will do peer-to-peer evaluations where we're asking students to evaluate one another. We will do case interview evaluations where they're actually looking at an interview and providing feedback about what they are seeing using the terminology and the concepts that they have been taught that week. We also do team building activities where they're working together on a case, where they may be developing an evidence disclosure plan together, or they may be developing an interview strategy. So, there's a lot of emphasis in our course about these practical exercises because it's hard to teach effective interviewing if I just lecture to somebody and put them through death by PowerPoint. I need to get them into a seat, have them feel a little bit of stress, but at the same time, I need to help them develop confidence in the techniques and feel confident with how they are utilizing the techniques. So when they leave the class at the end of the 5 days, they will actually go out in the field and use them. So Yeah, these practical exercises are absolutely invaluable.
Yeah, like Christy said, the DeTal Center, we do have some of those too. And just like you, we have some that go along with each one of our modules. And then we have the big one, which I kind of get to play around with the most. And
Mhm.
it's almost like a video game. I get to control a character on the screen, and then
Mhm.
you guys would pretend to be an officer and interact with that character. And we can pop up on the screen like, hey, don't forget, today we went over the 6 steps of de-escalation. Please make sure you use step 3, and we can pop that up on the screen just as a
Okay.
reminder. So it's really fun to play with that. And it sounds like you guys with your practical exercises have something similar.
We do. And, when I first started talking uh, with you folks about, the commonalities between what we're both doing here, I think there's a lot of carryover between what we have to deal with in terms of social dynamics, in terms of trying to communicate better with somebody, whether it's a de-escalation incident or whether it's a law enforcement interview. Uh, Communication, how we connect with somebody. So I think the social dynamics are very similar. And I also think there's a reassessment process here with a de-escalation type of training that we also have to deal with because we're constantly advising people reassess where you're at in the interview, just like you would advise an officer to reassess what's going on in a critical incident where they're trying to de-escalate somebody. And the last area I think there's a lot of commonality too are in some of the tactics that we're using. I think there's a lot of carryover here with the principles of motivational interviewing. And motivational interviewing is a interviewing protocol that was developed for a therapeutic clinical setting by Miller and Rolnick. But the concepts of motivational interviewing, providing someone with autonomy, acceptance, empathy, collaboration, and evocation, really were brought into the law enforcement training area by Dr. Lawrence and Emily Allison. And I'm going to guess that you use a lot of these same terms in your course as well.
We do. And I know earlier you talked about that perspective taking, and we do a lot with that, with having the officer remind themselves that, hey, I'm having a reaction to whoever I'm dealing with, but they're also having a reaction to me. So we have to be aware of each other's biases, of how we're going to interact with one another. So that way we're all on the same page and no one is escalating the situation.
Absolutely.
But that was all of the questions we had for you today, Christy. Do you have anything you want to say before we finish this up?
Just that I think what you all are doing is amazing and is so important. And it was a pleasure talking to you about it. And I'm glad that we got to learn more about it ourselves.
Well, thank you both for all the time you put in to make this happen today and for inviting me on. We are really looking forward to more collaborations with all of you, and we're looking forward to watching you roll out this training this year and seeing what the feedback is from the law enforcement community. So thank you again. We're very grateful beyond today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And with that, that's all we have for you guys today. As always, remember below you're going to be able to see where to find us on social media, our blog, and we're definitely going to make sure we connect you with all of the links to EVOCAVI's resources as well.